I'll start my presentation, and then hopefully folks will have some more after they digest all of that information for the end when we have our Q&A session. So I just wanted to kind of round out the day today. Again, this is, kind of the introduction to biological soil amendments of animal origin. And I think from my perspective, I think probably also from the grower perspective, it would be very helpful to kind of understand what the CDFA's Produce Safety Program has been observing as we started, to roll out inspections here in California. So I just want to thank my colleagues at the Produce Safety Program for sharing some of the data from those inspections, which I'm going to share with the group here. And I think it, kind of aligns really well with what Donna was just emphasizing, around the record keeping. Those resources that the PSA developed, they're great. So I encourage all of you to seek those out. I know that I've funneled them on to many people that have had questions around composting and biological soil amendments. So definitely seek those out. And so I'll end here just sharing some updates from those produce safety rule inspections, and then give a little bit of a primer for what's to come in the series. And really the content was developed from, a collective brainstorm from the speakers in the program, from our colleagues in CDFA, just, kind of based on what's being seen, kind of, where we are feeling knowledge gaps might be. So I know for many of you today was probably a bit of a review session, but I think in the next two sessions, we're really going to get in deeper for, how you would actually apply some of these concepts, how, you're going to work to, manage all of the records and establish that validated process. So with that, I'm just going to go ahead and jump into my slides here. And so I'm sure most of you are aware that here in California, the CDFA's Produce Safety Program is conducting the produce safety rule inspections. So you're not going to have FDA inspectors on your farm here in California. So the PSP, the Produce Safety Program, started these inspections in April of 2019. So to date, there's been over 300 farms in California that have gone through a FSMA Produce Safety Rule inspection as of March 2021. The majority of these inspections were the initial inspection. So the first Produce Safety Rule inspection on the majority of these farms. There's actually been 3 routine inspections, which I think is pretty impressive. So well done on CDFA's side. I know the pandemic has put a wrench in a lot of my out of office activities. There was one inspection for cause, so that would be an instance where there was a food safety risk concern identified that required that inspection to occur. And then there have been 5 re-inspections of farms following the initial inspection outcome. So, little over 300, but we have a lot of farms here in California that haven't gone through one of these produce safety rule inspections yet. So of the farms that have been inspected to date, the majority are the large farms. So as Donna was talking about, the farm size is based on annual average sales of produce. So our large farms are those that sell over $500,000 per year. Small farms are those that have that annual sales threshold between $250,000 and $500,000, and then our very small farms have sales between $25,000 and that $250,000 threshold. So again, majority of the farms inspected to date are in that large farm category. There have been 36 small farms inspected, and to date, only one very small farm has been inspected. No farms that have a qualified exemption, so that have that annual sales less than 25,000 have been inspected to date. So of all these farms, so the over 300 farms that have gone through this produce safety rule inspection to date, all of them reported having some type of previous food safety audits, with some of the farms being audited by multiple auditing schemes. So here you can just see some of those audits broken down. Primus was the most frequent type of audit the growers reported having, followed by Global Gap and LGMAs. But I think, kind of the take home here is that most of these farms that have been inspected they're familiar with food safety. They've been audited for food safety. Many of these audit programs are going to have stricter, I would say, requirements than the produce safety rules. So just keep that in the back of your mind as we go through some of these observations that have come out of these inspections. So the different types of activities inspected by the PSP so far are listed here. Growing operations were the most frequently inspected, but all these activities are covered by the produce safety rules. So I'm sure we'll see these numbers kind of leveling out, balancing out as we have more inspections taking place over time. But just to give you a kind of a sense of the different activities that were observed during those inspections. So in terms of observations related to subpart F, so as Donna already mentioned, subpart F is the part of the produce safety rule that applies to the biological soil amendments of animal origin. So in this particular category during inspection, there's actually a fairly high number of farms where no citations were needed. So I personally don't know whether this is due to the fact that the farms weren't using biological soil amendments of animal origin, or because all the farms were in compliance. But overall, this seems to point to the fact that folks are doing the right thing. There were 5 farms with observations related to section 112.60. So I know at least 5 of the farms were using these biological soil amendments. And, again, just kind of getting back to what Donna already mentioned, this section is related to the record keeping requirements for biological soil amendments of animal origin. So, record keeping is a really big piece of being compliant with the produce safety rule. It's kind of, if you don't have that written documentation, those records present, there's no way to know whether those activities actually happened on the farm. So I think we'll hammer this home next week and in the following week that records are really critical to ensure, that you're going to be in compliance with the regulation and not have any observations during inspections, but also so you internally can make sure that, the processes that are in place to ensure, ultimately a food safe product leaving the farm are in fact being followed. So in section 112.60, it states the grower is required to establish the following records related to biological soil amendments of animal origin. So if a grower is buying these biological soil amendments from a third party, They need to have documentation, i.e. that certificate of conformance, showing that producer of the BSAAO is using a scientifically valid process, and that process was monitored. And then that, during that production, that treated BSAAO was handled in a way that wouldn't risk contamination with any, raw feedstocks in the facility. So I will again point you to PSA's fact sheet, much more detail and practical information in that fact sheet that I'm presenting here. But just generally, so you're aware of, the requirements for that certificate of conformance. And then for anyone that is producing treated biological soil amendments of animal origin on farm, then you would have to establish your own documentation showing that these process controls, for example, the time, the temperature, and the turnings were being achieved. So again, Donna already touched on this, but just to emphasize, of the observations we've had in California related to biological soil amendments, it's around these records. And so, inform yourself, inform other growers you work with, that this is something that needs to be paid close attention to as you're preparing for these inspections. Some of the other common observations during the inspections was related to subpart O, which is referring to records in general. And so I just wanted to point this out because, there are specific criteria, specific information that needs to be on those records you're generating for your biological soil amendments for other activities. And so clearly there were some farms that didn't have all of that information on those records. So there were 114 observations related to section 112.161, which is the general record keeping requirements. So under the produce safety rule, records must include the name and the location of the farm, the actual observations. They should also include an adequate description of the produce applicable to the record, the location of the growing area that's associated with that record, the date and time of the activity. They need to be accurate, legible, and indelible, meaning, these have to be in ink and, something someone can't go up and erase and change. And then finally, these records need to be signed by the person performing the activity. So this holds true for any type of record you're generating on the farm. So just so everyone's aware of these requirements, and that this was a very common observation in some of those inspections we've already had in California. There were other observations related to records that I just wanted to point out. All these were much less frequent, I think only once or twice, but basically for storage of the records, these records can be stored off-site, but they have to be able to be retrieved and brought back to the farm within 24 hours of request. Electronic records, they can be considered on site as long as you can access them on site. So just something else to consider when thinking about records. And then, these records need to be made available to the CDFA Produce Safety Program within 24 hours of request. And so that's written in the regulation that upon request by FDA, or in our case, CDFA's Produce Safety Program, those records need to be handed over to them within 24 hours of request. So I think it's pretty clear that records are going to be a really important piece to focus on for biological soil amendments of animal origin, but generally, to support a farm's food safety compliance. I will just, mention here again that the majority of the farms that have been inspected to date, these are large farms, and all of the farms reported a previous food safety audit. So, my guess is that there might be more observations related to other parts of subpart F. Again, that's the biological soil amendments of animal origin piece of the regulation. Once we have more inspections occurring on farms that perhaps haven't gone through another food safety audit scheme, or they might have less capacity to manage food safety related to these biological soil amendments, just due to, sheer size of operations. So, I think what I presented here today, it's just the snapshot of what we know about the observations to date. But I think, that landscape is going to change over time as, we get more farms inspected and, more diversity in the size and types of operations that are being inspected. So I just wanted to kind of end here, giving you an idea of what we're going to cover in the future sessions of the series. So, we'll touch on records, definitely, but we also pinpointed some of these topic areas because of, I think, some general confusion that's out there in the world related to some of these concepts, and also, I would say, lack of clarity around the expectations with some of these topics. So we are going to talk about regulations and requirements for composting. So we'll talk about, what's in the produce safety rule, but we're also going to touch specifically on California's Code of Regulations, Title 17, which applies to compost manufacturers here in California. We'll also touch on LGMA and NOP requirements, which I know we've already touched on a little bit here. We will talk about scientifically validated processes for composting. We are going to talk about, what is raw manure versus compost, and, Alda already touched on application intervals, but we'll make sure those are clearly defined for you all. We're also going to talk a bit about animal grazing in production fields. I know there was a pre-submitted question related to this type of activity, and Alda's actually been doing some research in this space. So we'll talk to that a bit. We will talk about compost teas, so that will be in the third session. So we'll talk about what is okay to do and what is not okay to do, and, the rationale behind that. And in that third webinar as well, we're going to talk about non-manure based biological soil amendments and, concerns, issues there. So, ultimately, we're going to tie all of these concepts, back to food safety and the requirements under the produce safety rule. But we're also going to, inject some of the why we want to be using these biological soil amendments, the benefits to soil health, crop production, and the environment in general. So I'll invite Alda and Donna to come back on screen and unmute themselves. So there were a number of pre-submitted questions from you all when you registered. I kind of divided them up based on their content area to which session they would fit best into. We have a lot of questions already for the session next week. But I pulled out the ones here that I think are the most relevant for this session, and I'll look at the chat too to see if anything else has come in. So where shall we start? We could just run down the list. I think that, there were a couple of questions around testing, so maybe we'll just start there. And I know, Donna, you talked about testing a little bit already. But there were questions around if I'm testing my compost for these pathogens or generic E. coli, and I pass those tests, why am I still required to have all of these other documents showing the times and the temperatures and the turnings? So maybe Donna, you want to start out just speaking a little bit to the limitations of the testing.
Absolutely. So I mentioned this, that in the produce safety rule, there is no testing requirement. What we're going to talk about next week are a couple of the microbial standards. So the produce safety rule sets 2 different standards that the treatment must be validated against. And essentially this shows that by composting, you know, it treats the soil amendment to a certain standard. And that's not the same as testing requirements. So the produce safety rule takes the approach that you can't test your way into compliance. So the reverse of that is, say you treat a sample or treat a soil amendment, but maybe you don't keep the records or you don't actually take the temperature. You cannot just send away a test and say, okay, it meets that criteria. I believe the fear is kind of like testing produce samples, is that you don't get very many positives and that it's very easy to test in the wrong place or not get enough tests. So it's very easy to miss something if there is contamination. So it's more of the holistic approach of treating everything and monitoring that.
Yeah, I get a lot of questions about end product tasting or testing from processors, and you know, it's kind of like you're looking for a needle in a haystack, right? You might be testing in the wrong spot. If you're in the right spot, maybe the test method you're using only has a specific level that it can detect. So there, you know, testing, I feel, is it's a good kind of check on yourself, right? You know, you should follow that validated process that, you know, you're hitting those temperatures for the specific time. That's your assurance that you're reducing the pathogens, and then the test is just kind of a backup, you know, validation or verification step for that process. I saw some questions in the chat, and maybe this kind of feeds into the human waste question. So, you know, I know I do this. I tend to focus my untreated and treated to raw manure and compost, all of animal origin. So there were some questions in the chat around vermicompost and whether that is considered a treated or untreated biological soil amendment.
Yes, so I can take the first dibs or first attempt if you want. So I have some slides about this for next week, but I don't have them pulled up. But the short answer is, as I mentioned, the produce safety rule establishes these two treatment standards. So I talked today, because it's easy to focus on compost, like you said, I talked a little bit about windrow composting and aerated static composting. There's so much research done. It's already been validated against one of those levels. So we know that that's safe in terms of the produce safety rule. The requirement for something like vermicompost is it has to be a treatment in order to be considered a treated soil amendment. It has to meet one of those validated metrics or one of those criteria. The short answer is there's not research out there that shows that vermicomposting, that process of sending it through the worms, there's no research to support the fact that it meets one of those requirements. So right now, until more research has been done, right now it's kind of viewed as an untreated soil amendment. So when I've worked with growers, it's more, they might take vermicompost and then compost it and do it that way and then use it as a treated soil amendment, or they just use it as an untreated.
I guess to follow up on that, how about this? The question was around mushroom compost and organic farming. So we're not going to get into organic standards, but generally, if someone wanted to use mushroom scraps, kind of.
So I think the question is probably, so mushroom compost, back when I used to work in the Northeast, I used to work with this a little bit more. Mushroom compost is a specific compost that's often usually has like horse bedding and shavings and some other stuff. And it's usually like steam sterilized and then used in compost production. And then I think often when growers get to it, it's like the mushroom producers, I think, can use it once and then that's all. And then they send it on, they'll like sell it to farmers. And so it goes back to that treatment standard, which we will talk more about next week. Which my understanding is that it's a pretty hefty steam sterilization process. So most of the mushroom compost I've seen meets that metric. So it would meet the requirement to be considered a treated soil amendment. And this is actually talked about in the preamble. So again, very produce safety rule specific, but the produce safety rule says, as long as that mushroom compost wasn't recontaminated, then it can still be considered a treated soil amendment. So as long as it was handled appropriately, it's only been in contact with mushrooms, and there's not reason to believe it was contaminated, then it's still considered a treated soil amendment.
Great, thank you.
I just got that question a couple of weeks ago, which is wild.
I didn't know. I'm learning today too. That's great. So I guess we could address the human waste piece here. Donna, I keep pinging you. But I mean, maybe.
Okay. Yeah, I'm happy to talk a little bit about this one. So in terms of human waste, is when we say human waste, that's usually considered not treated. So human waste is not allowed for use on produce crops. And so here's another place I will specifically say the produce safety rule is baseline requirements. Oftentimes state, and I'm not as familiar with like California regulation, but I can say like Maryland, they don't even allow biosolids. You would have to wait a year for a treated biosolid, which is a treated human waste, to certain EPA standards. So generally, it's looked at as human waste and biosolids are going to be higher risk. So there's usually more requirements there, or it's straight up not allowed. But specifically, produce safety rule, human waste is prohibited. And biosolids, there are certain like classes of biosolids in EPA. They are allowed for use. So it's class A biosolids are allowed for use in produce, but I would heavily look at what your state and your buyers ask for, because oftentimes they're more strict.
Erin, I just want to answer to the fourth question. I think I forgot to mention when I gave overview about the survey you conduct. So the question is, how prevalent is the use of biological soil amendments of animal origin in California in produce cropping systems to follow the regional commodity patterns of use? So I forgot to mention that multi-regional survey we did. We observed that the participants, the growers, they were considered small to medium-sized scale. And they were, most of them were 85% certified organic, but they were small size, medium size. So they, in that annual sales less than 500,000. So if we're looking on California, most of the production, but you know, we could not just, we didn't look just California, but on the west side, we have much bigger growers in produce. So actually, when I started that survey, I was approached by different organizations, and we'll say, specific for the organic, we'll say, we are not sure why you're doing this survey, because organic producers in California, if they are part of the different commodities groups, they will not use and treat biological soil amendments. They use the treat ones. So just to clarify, most of those participants were small scale farms that we see it's quite different practice as larger producers in organic industry. And California was more, most of those producers, they will use treat biological cell amendments. For several reasons, because several reasons, food safety concerns, the demand, so and so on.
Great, thank you. I think the one outstanding, are there systems in place to use more animal waste in a beneficial way as a nutrient while maintaining produce safety and risk reduction? So, you know, I think there are a lot of programs and initiatives here in California related to climate change mitigation, healthy soils. You know, kind of the first thing I was thinking of was, you know, the Healthy Soils Initiative. You know, CDFA is leading. But, you know, I think there are kind of many different kind of initiatives, programs going on in the state to help, you know, divert waste from our landfills. I know next week when we have the representative from Cal Recycle come talk there, you know, they'll talk about, you know, the different state legislation that impacts organic waste ending up in landfills. So, you know, I think there's a lot going on. And Margaret Lloyd, who's one of our speakers for next week too, she's more entrenched in that landscape. So hopefully we can bring that question to her next week too. So it's 3:03. Two full hours of great information. I just want to thank the speakers again, Donna and Alda, great job, and thank everyone for coming today and for all of the excellent questions. Next week, same time, same place. If you've already registered and you're here today, there's no other action you need to take. We'll send you a reminder email next week, but the Zoom link is going to be exactly the same. We are going to ping you with an email this afternoon with a survey to give us some feedback on how you felt about the session today. And then give us, I'm going to say, at least a week to get the video edited and up on the website. But as soon as that is done, we will send you another email just letting you know that's available. All right. Thanks again, everyone. And we will see you in a week.